It had been a very long and tiring day at my work. I couldn't wait to get home and rest. As I drove back to my house, I noticed how eerie and quiet everything was. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets. Now, as I pulled into my driveway, I noticed that my dog, a German Shepherd named Roger, was already waiting for me at the front door. He had a relative look of excitement on his face, which I found strange as he usually laid down on the porch waiting for me. I opened the door, and Roger rushed towards me, wagging his tail furiously. I ruffled his fur, and then made my way to the kitchen to get myself some water. As I drank it, I glanced over at the window facing the forest, and noticed that Roger, too, was staring intently at it. I followed his gaze and saw nothing but the darkness of the trees. I shrugged it off, assuming he was just looking at maybe a raccoon or a deer that I couldn't see. But then, I heard a faint cry. It was so soft, I wasn't even sure if I had heard it correctly. But Roger's behavior confirmed to me that it was real. He started pacing back and forth, whining softly, and staring at the window again. I could feel my heart rate start to pick up, and I, too, began to feel nervous. I wondered two things. Was there someone outside trying to case my home, or was there someone in trouble? And if so, should I go out and help? But as I approached the window, I still saw nothing but darkness, and the faint cry stopped. Trying to rationalize everything, I chalked it up to my imagination and simply being too exhausted from work. But the nervousness stayed with me, and over the next several days, I noticed that Roger would always be on edge whenever I got home. He would bark incessantly at the window, the same window from before, the only one facing the forest. Sometimes he would flat out refuse to go outside to do his business. One night, I decided enough was enough and I needed to investigate the source of that faint cry that I had heard a few nights ago. Clearly something is going on if my own dog is picking up on something that I'm not. So I slipped my boots and jacket on, grabbed my large flashlight, and headed towards the woods. As I got closer, the woods were already pretty thick. It was late spring and everything had grown back in. I could barely see anything. I kept walking, but the sound of leaves and snapping wood made me nervous. And the sound of wind in the trees reminded me almost like quiet whispering. That's when my flashlight flickered, and then it died. Now, I was stuck in complete and total darkness. I started to panic. I felt like something was watching me, or at any moment, something would come up and grab me. And I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. It was either I'm extremely paranoid, or my intuition was warning me that something was really wrong. I quickly turned around and ran back in the direction towards my house until I could see my porch light. Once I got inside, I locked every door and window, feeling safer inside than out. I didn't want to mention anything to anyone since I thought they might think I was paranoid. Now days passed, and that initial fear I had never subsided. It only intensified. The ringing in my ears even became more frequent, and I kept hearing that faint cry on and off. And one day, as I arrived home, I saw a shadowy figure out of the corner of my eye. Now, I couldn't make out exactly who or what it was, but I knew I had to act fast. I quickly rushed inside, locked the door, and grabbed my phone to call the police. As I waited, I noticed Roger's behavior again. I realized he was sensing the same thing that I was. Because when the police arrived, I told them everything that had happened. Of course, they checked the area, but found nothing. No tracks, no signs of anybody casing my house or anything. they did suggest that I stay indoors until it could be investigated further. Of course, the days following were nothing short of nerve-wracking. Every time I heard a rustling sound or a faint cry, I felt like I was going crazy. That I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, just waiting for the right moment of weakness to present itself that they or it could strike. I recently learned about something called a skinwalker, and I couldn't help but wonder if maybe there was truth to it. I've heard that mentioning their names or even whistling at night could attract their attention, and now I can't help but wonder if that was what had caused all of this. My fear and paranoia only grew worse, and I found myself now constantly looking over my shoulder, even when I'm inside my own home. I knew I needed to do something, but I wasn't sure what. One night, as I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, I heard the loud thud outside. Instantaneously, my heart began racing. I get up and cautiously make my way to the window, the same one facing the forest, and my intuition starts telling me I need to look outside. So I peer outside, and what do you know? I see a figure moving in the darkness. Now my fears turn into anger, and I've decided I've had enough. It's probably some homeless person or something scouting around my property and causing ruckus. So I grab a flashlight and my pepper spray, and I march out there into the darkness because I'm going to give this guy what for. I had no idea what I was going to find, but I knew I needed to face my fear head on. Now, as I walked towards this figure, I noticed it stopped, turned, and faced me. I yelled at it, or what I thought was a him, and shined my flashlight on it, but was shocked to see it was a young woman. She looked scared and confused and wore clothing that was not of this era, I guess you could put it. I quickly called out to her and offered for help, and she told me she had been walking around here, that she lived here, had fallen, injured her ankle, and had been calling out for help, but nobody had heard her. The whole situation was strange. Here she was standing not only 10 feet in front of me, but her ankle appeared fine. Next thing you know, I turned to point at my house, telling her that I live here, and mid-sentence as I turned back to her, she was instantly gone. I wasn't exactly sure where she went or what happened. I was kind of flabbergasted. Not really sure what was happening, I made my way back inside, locked every window, locked every door, called the police again, and told them there's a young lady walking around in the woods outside my home that desperately needs some help. Could be a mental patient, I'm not sure. Within 15 minutes, a cop shows up, I give him the what for, and I tell him everything that had happened. He goes to investigate and check things out. He doesn't find anything. So now I feel like a buffoon because they think I tricked them into coming out to my property, but that's not what happened. The only thing I can think of, and bear with me here, the fact that I'm even mentioning this just sounds insane, but did I run into a ghost or something? I mean, I will say this. The fact that this young woman was in attire that looked like the early 1900s was really weird, but the fact that her demeanor and her body language was off, and who walks around at night in the wilderness without any sort of protection or light, and she acted completely not there, if you know what I'm saying. What really takes the cake for me is as I'm talking to her, and I literally turn for not even a few seconds and turn back to talk to her, and she's suddenly gone. Where we were talking, the woods were probably about 40 feet away from us. There's no way she could have sprinted from there, where we were talking, to the tree line in that amount of time. At least, not without me hearing or seeing it. There's nowhere she could have hid in plain sight. She literally just poof, vanish into nothing. I don't know how to explain it. I guess I should give you some additional information. My home backs right up against the Pisgah National Forest here in North Carolina. Now, I'm not really a ghost story kind of guy, so that's why I've been reluctant on talking about this, but I'm well aware that there's a lot of ghost stories regarding old Native Americans and the whole Civil War and Revolutionary War, so I'm not exactly sure if that has any tie into the situation, but again, the young woman was wearing clothing that you'd see from the early 1900s, like pre-World War I clothing, or at least that's what it looked like to me. Anyway, that's my story. If you choose to read this to your audience, I would love if they could answer my question on what they think I experienced. Was it a ghost or was it something else entirely? Because I do not know. It all started as a usual Saturday with a very close friend of mine. We had set out for a hike in the Pisgah National Forest. It was our favorite spot, with all of its dense wilderness and scenic trails. We had been exploring the forest for, years now, and we felt pretty comfortable in the area. As dedicated weekend explorers, we enjoyed fresh air, peaceful environments, and the occasional wildlife sighting. But this trip would prove to be different than our usual hikes. We began it early in the morning. This way we could avoid the heat of the day. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a soft golden light on the trees and illuminating the path before us. We chatted about our mundane week at work and looked forward to a much-needed break in nature. The trails were relatively quiet, and we reveled in that early morning serenity. A couple of hours into our hike, we came across a fork in the road. To the left was an unmarked game trail that we'd never explored before. Well, curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to venture down this new path. As we walked, we noticed that the trees almost seemed to grow thicker, and the atmosphere, it felt somewhat different than our usual trails. And just around noon, we came upon a clearing. In the middle stood a strange-looking tree. It was twisted, with what I can only describe as dark, scaly bark. It seemed really out of place among the surrounding landscape. As we approached, an unpleasant odor had filled the air. This made both of us pretty uncomfortable. We decided to rest and eat our packaged lunch at a safe distance from that tree. Jake, my friend, noticed something odd. My name was carved on the trunk of the tree, and even more disturbing, the exact date of that same day underneath my name, as if somebody was here earlier with the same name. Making a quick joke that we had randomly made our own carvings, this carving looked distinctly different from my own. It made me grow incredibly uneasy. I tried to brush off my worries and focus on the beauty of the forest that surrounded us. So, we decided to continue. The sun was starting to set, and we realized that we should probably head back just to avoid being stranded in the woods at nighttime. After all, what I saw really made me uncomfortable. It made us increase our pace back towards the known trail. On the way, we heard a few strange noises coming from the nearby bushes. We stopped, our eyes trying to adjust to the darkness, searching for the cause of the noise. This is when we saw something we cannot explain, for a tall, thin figure had emerged from the foliage, its eyes shining like reflectors in the waning light. We held our breath, not knowing what to expect. The figure remained still for a moment, before turning around with an "uh-oh, I've been spotted" expression. We can make out very little of its features, except for how unusually tall and thin it was. Our legs felt weak, but we knew we needed to get out of there immediately. We quickly retraced our steps, practically running back to the familiarity of the trail that led us toward our car. We did not speak. We were on edge for most of the time, until we reached the false safety of the parking lot. Once inside the car, we finally caught our breath and equally voiced our shared disbelief. Who or what was that figure? We couldn't be sure, but we agreed on one thing. We were certainly never going back to that same unmarked trail ever again. So that's when I got the research itch. I decided to hop on Reddit here and wanted to know if anyone out there has seen something similar. To my recollection, it was tall, white, and gaunt. I don't think it was a person, but what else could it have been? I've heard some people mention the term skinwalker or wendigo, but I'm not exactly sure what that is or if that's what we saw. Any answers would help us greatly. Thank you so much. I'll keep this account as clear and concise as possible. I've never really talked about this experience with anyone, but I'm 35 now, and after bottling this in for so long, I think it's time to finally share my story. This is a true account of the events that took place when I was about 12 years old, back in 2000. My family and I had moved to a small town near the Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina. It was my mom, my dad, my younger sister, and me. We lived in a modest house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by woods. We all loved the outdoors, so this location was perfect. Although, looking back, there were some strange things happening. One summer day, my sister and I were playing outside near the edge of the forest. We came across an old wooden shack, partially obscured by the foliage and the thicket. It looked to have been abandoned for many, many years, possibly an old homestead or even an old storage shed. We didn't think much of it at the time, but I remember feeling uncomfortable as we left the shack. Well, a few weeks later, my dad discovers a series of bizarre markings on the trees right near our house. They looked like they had been scratched into the bark with large claws. He thought it might be the work of a large animal, like a bear. But we never saw any evidence of bears or other predators in the area, like scat or other things. As the summer progressed, things would get stranger. In fact, one night, we all heard a blood-curdling scream coming from the north in the woods. It sounded like a woman, but when my dad went to investigate and called out, he found no one. A few days go by, and we start finding several dead animals in our yard, all of them seemingly killed by a large predator. Then, one night, the most terrifying event occurred. I was lying in bed, trying to drift off to sleep, when I suddenly felt a presence in my room. I looked up and saw a dark figure standing in the corner, barely visible in the moonlight. It was tall and thin, with long limbs and a featureless face. I was too scared to move or even scream. The figure just stood there, watching me, not making a sound. I could practically feel my heart in my throat. I was struggling to breathe. And as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, leaving me all alone. I ran to my parents' room, shaking and in tears. I couldn't sleep in my own room for months after that. In fact, things would continue to escalate in that same house. Probably about a year later, we moved away. I never experienced anything like it again, but the memories still linger on in my head. And I often wonder, and I know this might sound silly, but what if us disturbing that old shack had awakened some evil supernatural force? I know what you're thinking, that would be the perfect plot to a horror movie, but I don't know, because everything was fine until we checked that shack out, and then afterwards, all these strange things. I'm not actually entertaining the idea, but sometimes you gotta wonder. At the time of this encounter, I was roughly 36 and living on the outskirts of the Pisgah National Forest, a rather peaceful and remote area in North Carolina. Growing up, I'd always been intrigued by the paranormal, but that curiosity didn't necessarily make me a believer. I've always considered myself agnostic on matters of the supernatural, always attempting to approach situations with a high degree of skepticism and rationality. During the fall of 2019, I was working as a PI, private investigator, for those that don't know what that means, which often led me to spend nights alone in the forest, observing and documenting potential trespassers or poachers. As someone who has seen and heard plenty of strange things all throughout my career, I wasn't that easily rattled. However, one night in October, my understanding of the world would be forever challenged. The evening began like any other. Darkness would fall over the forest. I set up my equipment at a remote observation point, overlooking a section of the forest that had been disturbed by illegal hunting activities in the past. The unusually chilly night air was biting at my fingertips, but I was bundled up with a thermos full of hot coffee at my side. After a few uneventful hours, I heard a sound that triggered my curiosity. It was a distorted howling, coming from a distance that made it rather difficult to determine the actual source. But I'll tell you what, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I'd never heard a creature like that before. It certainly didn't sound like a regular animal. I decided to investigate, so I grabbed my gear and ventured deeper, careful to tread silently. The distorted howling had continued, guiding me only further in. As I moved, the sound grew louder and more unsettling. My heart would be thumping in and out of my chest, but I was determined to discover the source of this noise. Finally, I reached a section of the woods that was more or less cleared out, like a large meadow, but still had some trees there. In the dim moonlight, I saw something that defied all logic. What I saw was a large coyote, standing on its hind legs. Its eyes were glowing this eerie yellow in the darkness, and it seemed to be observing me, curious yet cautious. I was left frozen in place, barely daring to breathe, when it howled once more in that twisted, distorted manner. Then, like a hallucination, the coyote blinked out of existence, leaving me standing alone there in the meadow, heart nearly pounding out of my body. I was confused. I was petrified. I stumbled back quickly to my post and hastily gathered the rest of my equipment, not caring about my job or my duties. My only thought was to get as far away from that experience as possible. I drove home that night, rather quickly, locking every door and window, just trying to convince myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. It wasn't till a little bit after that I found out about the concept of skinwalkers, or people who could shapeshift, like those in the paranormal world. I can't say for certain that's what I experienced or saw, but something about it has completely changed my comprehension and the way I view the world around me. I may not be the full believer in every ghost story or supernatural legend, but I recognize now more than ever there are things in this world that still defy simple explanation, and the memory of that night alone will always remind me of that. Every year, my friends and I plan a hiking trip in the Pisgah National Forest. This way we can escape from our busy lives and just reconnect with nature. It's something I feel that everybody should probably do, but not many do. This was one such trip that I encountered an animal that I still had problems identifying. My experience, although strange and unexpected, is one that I felt very compelled to share. It was a cool spring morning when we set out on the familiar trails of the Pisgah forest. We were excited to be back in the peaceful woodland, away from the chaos of our daily lives. After several hours of hiking and exploration, we decided it was best if we split up for a bit, agreeing to meet back at our campsite by nightfall though. Wandering off on my own, I came across a small stream, and I followed it upstream for quite some distance, admiring the tranquility of the flowing water. Well, it wasn't long before I sensed that something was off. The peace that I had felt moments ago had vanished, and I now realized just how quiet the forest around me had become. All the sounds and songs of birds, insects, and even the wind had just seemed to vanish, leaving behind a silence so thick you could cut it. Continuing cautiously along the stream, I felt this persistent nagging that something or someone was observing me. Now, despite scanning my surroundings pretty thoroughly, I didn't see anything that stuck out. I didn't see anything unusual. So I pressed forward, trying to shake off the feeling. Now, I rounded a bend in the trail in the stream, and I caught the sight, the source of my anxiety. An animal unlike anything I'd ever seen before. Now, its general shape and size resembled a wolf, but its fur was a unique blend of reddish brown and gray. I want to say it was a timber wolf, but I've never seen a timber wolf looked like this. What struck me as truly strange, though, were its eyes. They were this piercing, almost intelligent golden yellow that seemed to bore into me. Since I've never been one to try and back down from animals in the wild, I attempted to make myself appear larger, waving my arms around, shouting and making a ruckus to try and scare it away. Heck, if it works on a bear, certainly it'll work on this wolf. But to my surprise and horror, it didn't even flinch. It held its ground and cocked its head to the side, as though it was studying me just as I was studying it. Realizing that my usual tactics were now proving very ineffective, I decided my best chance would be to retreat slowly, not wanting to provoke the mysterious animal. So I started to backtrack, and the thing suddenly began to move as well. But instead of following me, it seemed to parallel my path at a distance, maintaining its steady gaze on me. Now, this instantly made me nervous and very fearful, because here I was potentially dealing with a large, starving wolf that I was now going to be its lunch if I didn't leave in time. This continued for what felt like forever, but looking back, probably lasted no more than a few minutes. Now, I was fortunate enough to near a clearing, and it occurred to me then that I should try and capture a photo of this weird-looking wolf. So very cautiously and slowly, not trying to get any attention, I pulled out my phone, but was trying to be very sly about it, all while trying to keep my eye on this wolf that was now bobbing back and forth behind a large tree, as if hiding, but also trying to keep an eye on me. So I slowly raised my phone, focused in and zoomed in, and the strange wolf had vanished, leaving me standing there dumbfounded. I thought it was behind the tree, but I was zooming in looking, and I couldn't see any traces of it. I was disappointed, but I was also very relieved. I did not stand there for 5 minutes waiting for this thing to show itself. I just wanted to get out of there, because I didn't feel right. So I hurried back to the campsite, and I shared my experience with all my friends. They listened intently, and I could see their skepticism. They did insist that it might have just been a regular wolf or a wild dog. But I don't know. Just something deep down inside me, I felt like this was different. Like it was some sort of animal I couldn't understand. What it was for sure, I'll never know. But I can tell you this, that I firmly believe this was not a regular wolf I was dealing with. It was far more intelligent. It was the summer of 2005, if I can recall correctly, or somewhere right around there. I had just moved to Asheville, North Carolina, and was excited to explore the beautiful, amazing Pisgah National Forest. For you see, I had always been an outdoor enthusiast, and living near such a stunning place, for me, was a dream come true. I'm a North Cali boy by heart, and I've always wanted to come to the East Coast, so this was perfect. Now I know the Pisgah is known for many things like waterfalls and trails, and the woods out here on the East Coast are just different. Now my close friend Sean had actually moved to Asheville a year before me and had convinced me to move out here. But that's not what this story's about. Because he had told me countless stories about his adventures in the Pisgah National Forest, and even mentioned a few that weren't so great, like instances where he had witnessed some strange things in the woods, like odd noises and unexplained objects. So, we decided to head out on a weekend camping trip, eager to explore the trails together and see if maybe we could uncover anything unusual. We would set up camp at a clearing near a creek, the sound of the water providing a much-needed tranquil atmosphere. The campsite, surrounded by enough foliage, gave us enough privacy, yet we were still close enough to the main trail so we didn't feel too isolated. The first day went off without a hitch. We hiked for probably about 5 hours, just enjoying the beauty of the forest and all of its impressive views that it offered. The day soon turned to evening, and we prepared our dinner by the campfire. We had beans and steak and vegetables. It was amazing. And of course, we would tell stories of past hiking adventures and, of course, girls, and just pondering the mysteries of the forest. Night fell, we settled into our tents, and expected a peaceful and rather uneventful night. It was around midnight, and I was awakened by a strange rustling sound near the tent. Immediately I panicked, thinking somebody was going through our stuff. I was still pretty groggy, so I was trying to get my bearings. I heard Sean's voice from his tent asking if I was hearing the noise. I spoke back to him, confirming I did. This is when we both got out of our tents at the same time to try and investigate. He had his flashlight, I had mine. We scanned the area cautiously, looking for the source of this noise. We moved deeper into the forest, because now the sound had moved. What initially had sounded like it was coming from our camp was actually now deeper in the woodline, as if the sound could somehow move on its own. It was very weird. But the sound seemed to grow louder and more distinct, like it was changing. It was now turning to an eerie, unidentifiable noise, unlike anything we'd ever heard. At this point, we were both pretty on edge. I don't know if I'd say scared, but I guess you could say that our curiosity overpowered our fear. We approached a small meadow, probably about 10 minutes after, and to our utter disbelief, we saw something unlike anything we could have imagined. A peculiar, metallic-looking object in the clearing. It wasn't fully in view, though. It was partially obscured by the shadows of the trees. But it became clear that this was not something normal. Stunned, we stood frozen, unsure of what to do next or how to approach it or if we should even get close. Our eyes were just fixated on this mysterious object, trying to make sense of what we were seeing because it was so out of place. Now, almost instantaneously, we both heard a faint metallic clicking sound coming from the direction of this large object. We both panicked and agreed that it was time to retreat and return back to the safety of our tents. We didn't waste any time, and the thought of approaching that object, while curiosity was driving me to want to check it out, something inside me, call it my intuition, call it your gut instinct, whatever, something was telling me, do not go near it. And so we both turned around and we pretty quickly made our way back to our tents. And we couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone. Once we had made it back to our camp in probably around 7 or so minutes, we quickly discussed what had just happened and kind of riffed back and forth on what we both think we should do. It was around midnight, like I said, and so we were both half asleep, very tired, and we decided that maybe it would be best to pack up right now and leave as quickly as we can. He offered that we could just crash out at his place. So I didn't really want to pack up then and there and leave because I was so tired, but I don't know exactly what we were near or dealing with. And as far as I could tell, the sounds were only growing in volume. So not wanting to linger there any longer than necessary, we just gathered up all of our stuff, threw it in, and just left. Now the whole ride back to Sean's place, as tired and exhausted as we were, we just kept going back and forth about what we had experienced and what it could have been, and was it maybe a military craft? Was this an alien thing? Was it a UFO? Was it maybe a just submerged object? We were not sure, but it defied explanation, and it had no place being in that meadow. The only thing that I feel comfortable saying with certainty is that I got the impression it was some sort of machinery, hence the metallic clicking noise, but even that I can't confidently say for sure. It was early January when I decided to take a short vacation from my construction job, deciding to spend my free time camping in the Pisgah National Forest here in North Carolina. Well, I'm an avid camper, and I really cherished the quiet solitude of the woods and the opportunity to. I arrived at the designated camping area late in the afternoon, so I quickly set up my tent and campfire, eager to immerse myself in nature. But as the sun went down, the forest was enveloped in a cold, dark silence, different than usual. The only sounds around me were the crackling fire and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. After preparing and eating my dinner, I decided to go on a little night hike. I figured walking maybe a mile or two would help calm me down and just let me settle into bed. So I grabbed my light and a cigarette and set off on one of the well-marked trails, immersing myself in the crisp night air and the chorus of insects, which now seemed to be alive and well. Sometime around 9 p.m., while still walking on the trail, a dense fog began to roll in. This was not unusual for winter nights, so I continued on without much concern. However, as I ventured deeper into the woods, the fog thickened and the visibility in a short amount of time decreased significantly. Now I began to feel very nervous. The forest dropped down again in an unusual quiet state, and it seemed so desolate. I figured now's a good time to turn around and head back and maybe get some sleep. So I began to slowly retrace my steps, and a strange figure had caught my attention in the distance. It appeared to be a tall, humanoid creature with reptilian features, such as scales covering its skin. It moved slowly, as if purposefully trying not to draw attention to itself. Feeling both horrified and also curious, I cautiously followed it, keeping a safe distance, but only for a very short time. I don't even think more than a couple of moments. Suddenly, this creature stopped facing me directly. Our eyes would lock, and I instantly felt a cold, paralyzing fear wash over my entire body. The being's piercing orange-yellow eyes seemed to be looking right through me. I stood there petrified as this thing slowly tilted its head and emitted a strange sound. My instincts kicked in. I turned on my heels, sprinting back towards my campsite. My heart was pounding as I ran, desperately trying to create more distance between me and it. Now, whatever this being was began speaking to me telepathically. Its thoughts invaded my mind, telling me that I needed to leave or face dire consequences. The voice was insistent, threatening that it wouldn't take kindly to intruders. I felt my body seizing up, and running now felt extremely difficult. The feeling was akin to jumping into an ice bath for several minutes. And as I reached the edge of the campsite, the telepathic communication ceased abruptly, and the icy sensation began to subside. What overcame me was a physical and mental numbness. That's the only way I know how to describe it. I left everything I had and ran back to my car, where I blacked out and collapsed on the ground. Now, next thing I know, I'm waking up in a hospital room. It's the morning time. My body is aching and my mind is still reeling from the encounter. The doctors informed me that I was found unconscious by a ranger who happened to pass by early in the morning. They ran several tests, but found no explanation for my condition. The doctor who began talking to me was happy to see I was conscious and informed me that they had ran all the usual tests like blood work and whatnot, and everything looked relatively normal. I simply told them that I had just fainted and I wasn't sure why. Now, not that much happened between then and the time that I was released later that morning. Now, fast forward to the evening, and I began to develop strange and bizarre symptoms. Strange shaped burn marks began appearing on my skin that stung, and a throbbing headache would come and go. Over the next few days, these things not only persisted, but grew in intensity and pain. Around day 4 or 5, I began violently vomiting blood and had to go back to the hospital. Unfortunately, they couldn't find anything wrong with me, despite my serious current symptoms. At about the 10-day mark or so after my initial experience, everything just stopped all at once. I spent several weeks agonizing over whether or not I should share my story, fearing ridicule and the possibility of being deemed mentally unstable. However, I couldn't deny that something extraordinary and terrifying had happened to me in the Pisgah National Forest that night. Now, eventually, I would share my encounter with a few trusted friends and begin to research similar occurrences. I discovered that there are actually others who have experienced contact with reptilian beings, not only in the U.S., but all around the world. Now, to this day, I still struggle with understanding the true nature of my experience and the intentions of this being that I encountered. I'm just an ordinary guy. I didn't ask to have this experience. I did not want to have this experience. Initially, when I saw the figure in the fog, I didn't know who or what it was, and I just felt compelled for some reason to follow them or it. The only thing I ask is if you read this story to your audience, just please omit my name. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening. I can't believe it's been 5 years since my experience near the Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina. I hadn't really talked about it until the other day, actually, when I had come across some articles about similar sightings. I figured it was about time for me to share what I went through. Now, to understand, this was back in the summer of 2016. I was in my early 30s, working as a freelance nature photographer, always searching for the perfect shot. I decided to camp out in the Pisgah National Forest for about 5 days, hoping I could capture some stunning images of wildlife and the landscapes surrounding it. Now, one evening, after a long day of hiking and taking photographs of squirrels and deer, I set up my campsite near this beautiful creek. And just as the sun began to set, I decided I needed to move my legs because I'd been sitting far too long. So, I took a quick stroll around the area just before it got too dark. I grabbed my camera and headed towards the sounds of the creek, hoping to snap a few more pictures before nightfall. As I'm going along the creek, I began to notice an unusual stillness in the area. The usual sounds of the evening life, like the birds and insects, had now dissipated completely, which was very strange for this time of year. Now, I couldn't shake off this eerie feeling I had, but I decided to continue walking nonetheless. Now, approximately half a mile from my campsite, I began to notice something off in the distance, because what I saw, I'm pretty sure it wasn't a person. It looked like a very large, dark figure crouching down near the water. Now, my first instinctual thought was that it might be a bear, and so I approached cautiously. But the closer I got, I began to realize that this was no ordinary animal. It appeared, judging by my distance, to be around 7 feet tall, and it was covered in either black or brown fur entirely. It seemed to resemble a human more than an animal. I could visibly make out powerful arms and legs beneath the fur. But what caught my attention the most, however, were its ears. They were large, pointed, and remarkably like those of a wolf. Now, it took me a few moments to fully comprehend what I was seeing, but there was no doubt in my mind that this was an animal that I had ever seen before. Quickly and silently, as much as I could, I raised my camera and tried to snap a few photographs. I was certain that nobody would believe my story without evidence, no matter how convincing I might be. Now, surprisingly, this creature or animal didn't seem to notice me. It continued to crouch by the creek, looking at something, fortunately oblivious to my presence. Without warning, it seemed startled by something. It quickly stood up on its hind legs, looked around. Now, in this moment, I held my breath, afraid it would spot me and possibly attack. It seemed confused or maybe even scared, as it scanned around it like something spooked it. And finally, it leapt over the creek probably about 10 feet and took off into the woodline, disappearing into the dense foliage. I used this as my getaway opportunity and retreated back to my campsite. I couldn't believe what I had just witnessed. I knew that I had to leave quickly and report this. Now, that night, I slept with one eye open, worried that this animal might return. And I even heard something large moving just outside my campsite that same night. But I couldn't tell what it was, whether it was a person or an animal, and it never came into my camp. Fortunately, I made it to morning, and I did not hesitate to pack up my stuff at the crack of dawn, eager to leave and share my story. Once I got back near town, I had contacted the forest rangers, and I showed them the pictures that I took. They seemed skeptical and couldn't really make out what I took. They couldn't really offer me any explanation and kept saying that I just saw a bear. But I told them it looked nothing like a bear, that it was distinctly canine in the head. I don't think they took me seriously. They told me to keep the story and the photographs to myself, just to avoid causing any unnecessary panic or drama. So since then, I've kind of just kept it to myself, following the advice. But after discovering more recent reports of things similar to this, I guess I just feel compelled to share this with others. Now, I can send you the pictures if you want. I guess they're not all that great because it's kind of hard to make out, but it might be better than anything. So you let me know if you're interested in that. Now I'll tell you this, I still can't believe what I saw that day. And I know you're probably reading this and thinking, yeah, right, but if you had been there with me and you would have saw what I saw, it'll never leave your mind. That much I can tell you.